All right, we have the final session. You've made it to the end. Congratulations. Um, and we're looking at chapters 7 and 8 today. Bringing the book to a close. The authors ask a couple of questions or lay out their outline for this chapter on page 151 at the top. Just a few things left for them to cover. How does God's authority relate to the authority of the state? What type of state should Christians support? And how should Christians manage differences within the diversity of the state they find themselves a part of? All right. So we begin just looking at, kind of how does God's authority and the authority of the state work out? And again, they quote from Romans chapter 13, but they also quote from 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. On page 152, the first paragraph of text there, following the quotations from Scripture, says the takeaway is that when you read these passages, the takeaway is that almost any government is better than anarchy. God gives government as a gift to humanity to bring welfare, safety, order, and justice to human community. When government performs its job well, it enables freedom to flourish, perpetuates peace, and administers justice. And whether we're talking about villages, whole societies, or mega cities, we need collective government. Otherwise, our way of life descends into lawlessness, and in lawlessness might always makes right. Okay. There's a good definition over here on page 153, the last full paragraph. Speaking about Christendom, because we have shards of Christendom left in corners of the Western world. The state was considered a divinely arranged social order where people were united in a common geography, ethnicity, religion, and morality. The various classes or spheres of society each recognized that they had a duty to God and to one another. God had anointed kings and appointed them to rule wisely and benevolently over their subjects. But Christendom's concord was broken down by the awful malevolence of absolute monarchy, the terrors of empire, the rise of religious diversity, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, legal evolutions towards individual rights, the rise of nation states, the conflict between capital and workers' rights, as well as the legacy of colonial injustices. And this is basically, if one wanted to know the history of Western civilization, that's pretty much it on the European continent for sure. Christendom had such a traumatic experience of absolute monarchy that it had to deconstruct its faith and dismantle the religious apparatus of the state. Okay. So we live in mostly a post-Christendom context, and down in that last paragraph, not the last paragraph, but the last full paragraph on 154, they say in a post-Christendom context, whether in a communist state or in a democratic republic, God does not ordinarily enter into the conceptualization of state authority. To reiterate, that has a historical basis. The limitations of divinely sanctioned despotism, even with a wise, benevolent, and pious despot, were plain and self-evident. The authors are not convinced that Christian monarchies were the worst system of governance, given that the alternatives of the time were pagan tribal confederations, Islamic caliphates, or being the vassal of Eurasian steppe armies. Still, it was not hard to improve upon Christendom, the downside of absolute monarchy, often propped up by a bishop, declaring that to disobey the king was the same as disobeying God, was evident to a good many. Now, where would they have gotten that idea, to disobey the king is to disobey God, a flat reading of scriptures like Romans 13, 1-7, and the passage from Peter. But good old Western liberal democracies, without the stability produced by a representative monarch or a shared meta-narrative, have always run the risk of fragmentation. And then when he says it's Republican little r, they're not talking about the Democrats and Republicans here, but it's Republican fratricide. Mere opposition to a king, czar, or sultan does not unify a population for long if it is pregnant with ethnic, religious, and class rivalries. So that kind of gets into a little bit of what we're dealing with, and as we age and as we become more diverse, this nation. We don't have, I don't think, class. I hope we don't have class rivalries. We don't, but we certainly have rivalries going on in other ways. But I do like this in the middle of 155, that paragraph that begins, "Take heed. No democracy can survive external actors maliciously exploiting its internal fissures." And when I think about that, there's a lot of talk, and I don't read it enough to know anything at all about it. So I give you, we've had meddling in elections, meddling in other things. We've got, Russia trying to bust the internet up, or we've got, like I say, I've just heard shards about it. But it's hard for the democracy to survive when we have those from the outside who are capitalizing on the fissures on the inside. It's just my opinion that all of this internal strife that we're having is fertile ground for those outside to just come. And when I say that, I mean the leaders of the world.
I agree.
To come in and so that's
I
just
think so too.
one of those things. Go ahead, Ed.
Well, when you turn around and borrowing all that money from all these other governments, you're inviting them
Well, that's true. Yeah, that's true.
in.
Hey, Crystal's with us.
As far as the class thing.
Yes, sir.
We're talking about, we don't see it as much out in the country around here,
Yes, sir.
but I think in the cities,
Yeah,
you have a lot of class
I'm sure.
discrimination. one
that
or the
makes
other.
sense. Yes, sir. The last sentence in that paragraph I was reading from, democracy cannot survive without having a story about its struggle for freedom and the origins of its rights and duties, or without knowing the true purpose of human flourishing. And so this is where the Christian story possesses acute political utility in setting forth a story where evil is real, where evil takes the form of empires, from Pharaoh to Caesar, where the mundane and the menacing can also take root in ourselves. The answer to evil is not revenge, it's redemption. When empires do their worst, God sets them aside with the divine revolutions of Exodus and Easter. Indeed, the Eucharist, of the Lord's Supper, is where we celebrate God's reign, siding with the victims of empire, vindicating the people, and bringing victory over sin, death, and evil. God conquers the despot lurking in all our hearts. I like that line. In this story, the state is simultaneously a source of evil and a potential safeguard against it. I do think that we can argue that God authorizes the state to effect a common good, a specific vision of justice, security, and welfare. So, I think we talked about this a little bit last week. I do think it's absolutely appropriate and necessary for Christians to be involved in politics, and not to get their way per se, but to present the Christian way, to present God's way, to present the way of Exodus and Easter over against some of the other narratives that are being run out there. So, okay. Is there anything else from this section? Oh, well, I think it's good. I like the summations. I like books that have summations. There haven't been a lot in this book, but here in this last chapter on page 157, he does give us a summation. God gives authority to the state for the common good. I think we can all say amen to that.
Mm-hmm.
The state does not possess authority as much as it performs a divinely delegated task with authority. Again, amen. The notion of a divinely delegated state authority, as per Christendom, was open to manifold abuses, hence the need for an authority that operates on the basis of the consensus of the government by the people, for the people. Okay. The problem with stateship from below is that it becomes fragmented and fratricidal without a sustaining narrative or a supporting vision of the common good. A lot of what was happening with the Civil War is underneath that. Any time that a country breaks into civil war, the state's breaking up. Some of that has to, but still, therefore, Christians can insist that the state is neither infallible nor inviolable. It answers to God. And the stories and symbols of Jesus can furnish a republic or commonwealth with resources to forge bonds of civil affection and common purpose. And I think we all say amen to that. That's the best case scenario, so moving from that, the Christian case for liberal democracy. The liberal, again, want to, tell anybody that watches this recording, listens to this recording, that when we use the word liberal here, when our authors use the word liberal here, we're not talking about the liberal conservative divide that's present, all over the world, I guess, but in our particular context as well. A liberal democracy is human right there at the very bottom of the page, the very last line. That we as Christians, but before that, we as Christians believe that all men and women are created equal. But the only way you know that is if you've actually read and been shaped by Genesis 1, verse 27, and John 3:16. That's really the only way that's the only kind of people that would come at it from that. So because of that, human rights and religious pluralism have their deepest roots in countries formed by missional Protestantism. And he gave you, if you want to read more about that, you just chase those resources down there at the bottom of the page. Political liberalism, far from being the formidable foe of Christianity, proves in fact to be its lost child, who refuses to believe the truth about its paternity. It doesn't want to give, you are not the father, They don't want to give Christianity credit for the fact that they indeed find their roots in Christianity. So, again, I like this little, go ahead, Hinton, please.
I was gonna ask, Genesis 1:27, is that the verse where a woman is to be the helpmate of man? Or is that the one where the woman's taken from a rib from man?
Yeah, those are in chapter 2. Genesis 1:27 is let us make humankind, or man and woman, or man, in our image, male and female. Yeah, that's what it is.
Because I'm thinking that the verses where a woman was made from man's rib.
Yeah.
And all is where man got the idea that he could rule over women.
That would be, yeah, that and the fall in the curse.
And also, it says that she is to be the helpmate of man, which, sort of puts her on a second level too.
It can. The Hebrew by itself doesn't suggest that. The Hebrew by itself simply states, because if you think about it, I'm glad you asked. Right before woman is created from the rib, Adam is presented with the opportunity to name all of the animals. This is in Genesis 2. But as part of that, God is also trying to find a helper suitable for Adam. Not someone he can rule, but someone who can come alongside him and partner with him in life in a complementary way. And it is at that point that when no helper suitable was found, God puts Adam to sleep, takes the rib from his body, and creates woman. And the only time it gets to this idea of your desire will be to, this is in Genesis 3, certain readings of Genesis 3 when the curses are handed out. When God hands out the curse to Eve, he says, your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Certain readings of that have made that sound like, well, he's your boss and you need to do everything that you need to do. And that's an overly simplistic rendering of that, but I don't think it was meant that way. Men and women were meant to come together. I know there's been a lot of hubbub recently because Harrison Butker, I still love him, he beat Georgia one year. He's a kicker at Tech, but he has come out and, Harrison, I appreciate him, but come out and told a bunch of college graduating females that their highest calling is to be homemakers and things like that.
Or that's what they're really interested in, is getting the husband.
Yeah, and
Of course, that was at Georgia Tech too, right?
No, he was at Benedictine College and, but anyway, that's all I'm gonna say about that. Go Jackets, but I really wish somebody had, proved his, but anyway. He shared his opinions, they're his opinions. When you give somebody an open mic like that, there you go. So good luck tonight out at Winder Barrow, by the way. Yeah. So yeah, I'm glad you asked that. But yeah, they were made equal, and something happened in the fall that broke that equalness that Genesis 1 talks about. Let us make humankind in our image. But that's great. I'm glad you brought that up. Okay. All right. I know all of you have read The Lord of the Rings. He mentions that over here on 159, talking about a critique of authoritarian regimes. J.R.R. Tolkien in his allegories of Isengard and Mordor. Carol, I know these are household names.
Sure.
But in his Scourging of the Shire, he also, Tolkien, he gives an implicit critique of the earth-scorching bureaucratization that takes place in democracies. Tolkien was, in the end, a Catholic eco-royalist who preferred a monarch acting as custodian of people and pastures to a democratic socialism with its bean counters, endless rules and regulations, and multiplication of committees. Even David Bentley Hart labels Tolkien as an anarcho-monarchist. That's a really cool term. But the early Christians, like the Jews of their day, were not particularly worried about how a ruler became a ruler, whether authority was inherited or acquired in a palace coup, by conquest or in revolution. But they were very concerned about how rulers behaved and what they did once they became rulers. History shows that there is no single political structure that Christianity is tied to, as Christians have lived under and advocated for different types of government. Be that as it may, we can provide a Christian defense of liberal democracy, not as the only type of government Christians may wish to support, but perhaps the one that can be undergirded with the Christian vision and which represents a type of wisdom that will make the most of human endeavors. And I think one of the things here that we can glean from this is that I don't know if there is a leader with something approaching Christian character that's going to be up for election in the presidential election this coming year. I just don't. I mean, it mattered to Christians, far above policy, far above. It mattered to a lot of my Christian friends back in 1997 and 98 when we had the, when the Miss Lewinsky, you guys remember that?
Oh, yeah.
I heard about it down at Buffington Road Christian Church. I heard about it all the time. Character matters, character matters, character matters, character matters. And, he was, sorry, Bill, but you shouldn't have been doing that stuff, brother. But it does matter. It really does. And what hurts is, looking for character is just hard. It's hard to find.
Looking for character in any politician.
Well, I want to hope that there's at least a couple out there. But yeah. All right. So moving around to the next phase here. Carol, we haven't heard from you today, and I was wondering if you had anything highlighted in the Christianity and liberalism section.
Yeah, I highlighted beginning with that second sentence,
What page?
159, I'm
Okay,
sorry.
that's okay.
In order to love our neighbor, we must allow our neighbors to be beside us and yet be different from us. Our neighbor has permission to be other than us.
Right,
And then I went on,
okay.
that whole paragraph, I
Yeah.
thought had some very good statements.
Yeah, everybody in America, I'll say it, everybody, legal citizens. Those that aren't legal citizens need to be helped to become legal citizens. But yes, everybody is, our founding documents say this kind of stuff. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. But we, top of the next page, loving our neighbor requires us permitting and even celebrating the freedom of others to find happiness, fulfillment, flourishing, purpose, and meaning in ways that we might disagree with or disapprove of. Unless their happiness is to the direct detriment of our own, our neighbor is free to be who they are, how they are, where they are. Yeah, there's a typo there. Where they are, whenever they are. That's true. Love of neighbor is a way to disrupt hierarchical, grievance-based, identity-ordered ways of assigning status, and therein lies the rub. All right? This speaks truth to me. There was a song from a group that I know nobody, well, Carol, you've heard them, but I know probably quickly forgot them after you heard them. They're kind of loud. The Galactic Cowboys. I know
yeah.
that's a household name. Band out of Texas. They had a song called Flag, and this was back in 2000. And the chorus basically just described different groups that were kind of putting stuff in the face. And I know that this will not be very popular, but I want to say it in the context of reading this right here. That one of the choruses goes, waving your flag in the air, rainbows and leather and flare. Do you want to know if I even care? I don't care. And it's not a negative, and it's pointed at the LGBTQIA community, who at that point had started to, but what it is, and I tread very carefully here, because I agree with this, that they are free to be in this country and be who they are and live where they are, but it doesn't have to be something that becomes, we have to be able to agree to disagree. We have to be able to agree to disagree on that. And that's just one example. And that's probably one of the big examples, but the other, our Muslim neighbors, our Jewish neighbors, our Hindu neighbors, our no religion neighbors, or even our Christian neighbors that we can't stand. Oh, did I say that? We all have to, this what's so great about a nation like ours is that they are free to find that happiness, but we have to learn how to agree to disagree. And we're not talking about church here. We're just talking about living together. How can we be Christ in the world? So we are kind of talking about church. What does that body of Christ look like out in the world? And again, my whole point in quoting that song is, look, we can agree to disagree about, what about your lifestyle or whatever, your religion or whatever. But that doesn't mean we have to be enemies. That doesn't mean that. Yeah.
The thing that gets me all the way through history, it seems that the church has focused on the sins of the world instead of the people themselves of the world, their needs.
Yeah.
And that's what I think has caused the biggest problem for the church is the fact that, everything they talk about is their sins. And as far as the homosexuals and all of these others, I don't particularly care for their lifestyle or anything about them.
Right.
But God still loves them.
Yes. That's right.
And all have sinned,
Right.
so.
They're made in the image of God.
Right.
And God is the ultimate judge.
And there's the rub. There's the rub, because, there are different ways of looking at, they might have been made in his image, but they don't have it anymore and all that. That's a different book. But as for the purposes of this book, you know, ours is to love them. And they go on here, same paragraph.
Yep.
The natural sequel is love of enemies. We all know that passage from the Sermon on the Mount. The best way to destroy our enemies is to make them our friends, our partners, our neighbors. If you want more about that, Matthew 5-7 can help you. If we add to that the parable of the Good Samaritan, then we recognize that our neighbors who are religiously and ethnically different from us have the same capacity for goodness, love, and mercy that we possess. We choose to affirm the freedom to be different and to accept other people's choices insofar as they are not detrimental to any other good. Liberalism means liberty to love despite our differences. Liberalism prefers generosity over conformity, and liberalism chooses to find goodness in others. Okay?
Yeah, I thought that bubble.
Yeah, and go ahead,
One
Ben.
thing that I think confuses a lot of people when they say you love them. They think that means that you gotta join in and take part with them, stuff like that. It don't mean that at all.
No. It's not a blank check. No, it's really not. That's right.
I mean, just the fact that, you know, you don't go out and try to burn their houses or kill them.
Right.
Means that you can still,
Step in the right direction. It really is. I mean,
it's just the fact that you let them alone and let them do their thing. And you interact with them, you treat them like anybody else.
yes,
With
sir.
respect, and if they treat you
Kindness.
with respect and go right along.
That's what Jesus did. Yeah.
Yep.
Respect and kindness.
That's what Jesus did.
Acknowledge of his people.
Yep.
He did. Yes, sir.
Yes, he did.
Yes, ma'am. All right. Now there at the bottom, that last sentence on page 160, leading into the end of the paragraph on 161, you know, talking about liberty. Liberty is the norm, not the exception. Any curtailment of liberties must be exceptional rather than excessive, fairly distributed rather than targeted at particular demographics. Change of public order must be consensual, and disagreements resolved through persuasion rather than by deception or coercion. And then they give you a qualification here. That liberty in liberalism is neither absolute nor endless. The law exists to uphold liberty as much as to restrict it. That is because no person can be fully autonomous, a law unto themselves, without responsibility to others in their choices and actions. All rights have limitations, just as all freedoms come with responsibilities. And then he goes into this discussion with John Paul's Evangelium Vitae, pointing out the limitations of absolute autonomy, and he is right. We're not just a mass of individuals, as he says, placed side by side. We can't be with no mutual bonds. We can't be. You know, and it goes back to that classic commercial from the late 70s, Coke commercial. I'd like to teach the world to sing, you know. We'd all just have a Coke, you know. For me, it would be Diet Coke. For him, it would be Coke Zero. But we could all just have a Coke product. How about that? But that doesn't sing as well, you know. You know, if we could all have a mutual bond over something, and we've lost that to a certain degree. But yeah. Okay. So let's move on.
You know, the one thing that
Yeah. Go ahead.
I see and I've always disagreed with, it talks about
Yes, sir.
bonding us in our diversities. It's not our diversities that bring us together, it's how we're alike. And when you talk about diversities, it's like you want to keep everybody separated rather than.
Can be. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So Christianity and democracy. Carol, you got anything highlighted in that particular page 162?
The first paragraph.
Go ahead.
And,
Anything out of there jump out to you?
well, the very last sentence, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary.
Right. Up above that, about the fifth line down. Oh, well, you can't prove democracy from the Bible any more than one can prove religious freedom, judicial independence, or freedom of association. The Bible does not teach democracy in the same way that it teaches that Jesus is Lord, murder is wrong, and disciples should not act like unholy hooligans. I always know when Mike Berg has taken over a church. It gets a little bit snarky, all right? The sentences aren't as long either. Linnell and I talked about that last night. But we do find in the Bible spasmodic accounts of leaders being appointed by popular consent, and he goes through a couple of those. But the Christian scriptures, I'm just a couple of lines down, but the Christian scriptures do provide some principles and a type of wisdom that suggests to us who inhabit a civilization shaped by the Christian Revolution that democracy is a desirable type of government. Democracy is somewhere between expedient and advantageous, given the nature of human beings is sinful to the bone, and given that God's goal for human beings is to be part of covenantal communities filled with love for God and love for their neighbors. And then you get the quote from Niebuhr there. Man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary.
That whole paragraph.
Yeah,
It's
it's
real
great. It's great. And then over on the next page, you guys go into the vulnerability of democracy. I'm about halfway down after the 28th footnote there. The vulnerability of democracy to a slide into dictatorship is evident from how Hitler found a way to become the that was Freudian, the democratically elected chancellor of Germany in 1933. They voted him in, and then fused the office of president and chancellor to become Führer in 1934. The Czechoslovak communist leader Klement Gottwald was democratically elected as prime minister in 1946, staged a coup d'etat to become president in 1948, imposing a Stalinist model of governance. So democracy is only as good as the people and institutions guarding it.
Yeah, and there was the sentence back up a little way.
Yeah, go ahead.
One obvious, about mid-page.
Yeah, I see it.
One obvious problem with democracy is that power ends up in the hands of people who desperately want it. They want political power more for their own interest and ideology than for the common good.
It doesn't happen. Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah, it
Yep.
does.
All right, so the next page, another list. I'm not gonna take the time. There are benefits that liberal democracy, gives to its people, and these are important. These are possible, and are all part of a liberal democracy. I'm not gonna take time to go into any of those. You guys have heard of them. So that's good. And I appreciate very much Wright and Byrd on page 166, discussing, this is all very Anglo and Eurocentric. I mean, obviously. We need to consider how Christians in the majority world have related to governing authorities and note the complicating factors in discrete locations caused by geography, history, colonialism, corruption, tribalism, sectarianism, and religion that determine the political infrastructure. Also, Western liberalism might not be easily indigenized or parachuted into the non-Western settings where there is no conception of shared humanity, no tradition of individual rights, no concept of secularity, and no separation of powers. And this is precisely why the attempts to turn parts of the Middle East and Central Asia into liberal democracies have either proved difficult or been an abject failure. Or else some countries such as Turkey, Indonesia, Malaysia, and India are democracies, but they're not liberal in the classic sense, as they're tied to ethno-religious civilizations that place firm limits on political, personal, and religious liberties. So, local factors in immediate history have always shaped how churches have related to the state authorities. And this is a great discussion. T.S. Eliot's quote is worth remembering there at the bottom of this paragraph on page 167. To identify any particular form of government with Christianity is a dangerous error, for it confounds the permanent with the transitory, the absolute with the contingent. Yeah, all human governments in the end will sink like stones. Okay? But they still are advocating for liberal democracy. And I think they're right. I think that of all the governments in the world, I think this is probably definitely the one that gives the best chance. Now, the last part of this chapter, confident pluralism. Had you ever heard of that term?
I had not.
Confident pluralism? Yeah. How do we ensure a fair go for everyone? You know, free countries, I'm in the first paragraph under the case for confident pluralism, page 170. Free countries attract a diversity of people with diverse ideas precisely because people are free to disagree. There exists out there, at least it's been my perception, that when the colonies were founded, everybody was the same stripe Christian. Everybody was the same. It was homogeneous. All the colonies from the top to the bottom, everybody was the same. And one of my favorite phrases, theological phrases, that is cock-a-doodle-doo.
Yeah.
Part of the reasons that some of the different colonies were founded, have you ever made the connection? Maryland, we call it Maryland. Maryland. How about Virginia? Virgin? Yeah. It wasn't all, everybody was the same. That was part of the problem. They were running from the Church of England. Part of it. And they didn't like the tax on the tea either. That's what I was taught in school. But anyway, but before we get further down into that, we're free to disagree, dissent, and debate, but therein lies the tension. Because diversity means conflict. A society of Baptists, agnostics, Muslims, atheists, conservatives, progressives, LGBTQ+, immigrants, rich, poor, all living together, cheek by jowl, will breed an assortment of perspectives in terms of how society should be governed, what laws should be passed, and how to manage our differences. When diversity meets democracy, it always creates friction, and I absolutely love this next sentence, friction and frustration. How is a progressive, single, white, male, gay, vegan, anti-vaccine, pro-legalized cannabis, pro-open borders atheist working in hospitality to live beside a conservative, black, Baptist SUV driving, bacon-loving, gender-critical, stay-at-home mother of 4? Democracy's strength is that it can sustain diversity. Democracy's weakness is that diversity creates conflict.
Yes, it does.
So they
Yes, it
talk to
does.
us about confident pluralism. And they get this from John Inazu. And then there's another name that gets thrown around here in this discussion too. We've read a little bit of his stuff. Tim Keller, who also speaks to this in a book called Uncommon Ground. I like his definition. It offers a political solution to on page 171. It offers a political solution to the practical problem of our differences. Down toward the end of the quote, he says, yet confident pluralism remains possible in both law and society. Confident pluralism allows genuine differences to coexist without suppressing or minimizing our firmly held convictions. We can embrace pluralism precisely because we are confident in our own beliefs and in the groups and institutions that sustain them. Okay? And then in that very next paragraph, confident pluralism has a very simple premise, namely that people have the right to be different, to think differently, to live differently, to worship differently without fear of reprisal. Confident pluralism operates with the idea that politics as instrumental rather than ultimate value. In other words, politics is a means, not an end. No state, no political party, no leader is godlike or can demand blind devotion. Any attempt by political actors to create social homogeneity by compelling conformity, by bullying minorities, or by punishing dissent, whether in religion or in policy, is anti-liberal and undemocratic. That's a mouthful. All right. So look down at the bottom of page 172. Talk about victory. about halfway down in that last paragraph, after footnote 47. Victory in liberal democracy is not vanquishing our opponents, but winning their respect, living in peace with them and affirming their right to their opinion. And again, it just means LGBTQ plus people have the right to be themselves. Muslims can be Muslims and Christians can be Christians. Socialists can be socialists and greenies can be greenies. We can disagree with what other people say, but only if we are willing to defend their right to be disagreeable. In the end, nobody has the right not to be offended, just as nobody has the right to silence criticism of their political perspective. What is more, if our culture cannot form people who speak with both conviction and empathy across deep differences, then it becomes even more important for the church to use its theological and spiritual resources to produce such people. So the final word, bottom of the page. That type of pluralism creates peaceful participation in politics by people of all stripes. This pluralism is not the ultimate goal of Christian endeavors, but it is expedient for the promotion of the gospel and the practice of peace on earth. And I think that's true. And I think that's what we need to be about as followers of Christ. Now, I'm not going to go over chapter 8. It was merely a running through of the big tenets of this book. So that's my last word in this book. Take all of that with you to the polls. We may be doing it again in June, I'm afraid. Local runoffs and things like that. But do you have anything else today as far as the book goes?
Is talking about the early churches and stuff like that, people coming over here based on their beliefs.
Yeah.
It's interesting, if you ever go through any of the old churches that was built along about the time that these colonies and things were being built, how each family had their own little box. The rich was always up close to the front, the politician up close to the front, and everything was segregated.
I saw that in Williamsburg, in that Episcopalian church. Crystal said on here, she texted Greg Reed. All right. We're so glad that you read it with us, Crystal. Thank you for doing that.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Go ahead, bud.
I'm gonna say it is, the ones that you're talking about also in Charleston.
Yeah.
Every church is like that, it's not just one.
Yeah, that's right.
The big contributors
Yeah,
get their spots,
it's true.
which is as it should be. We smaller ones appreciate it.
Yeah, indeed. All right. Well, we're gonna take a break for the summer and we'll see what we do in the fall, but thank y'all. So all of y'all, and thank you for those that tune in. Appreciate that very much. Hope it's helpful for you. And, we look forward to, a bit of rest from the reading club, and we'll get back together real soon. So everybody take care. Have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend. Bye-bye.